Hi, here in our seventh lecture, we are going to see Paul crossing the Aegean into the Grecian peninsula. This will be not only important for the history of the early church, this will be important for the whole history of Europe. Because as we shall see, Paul was thinking about turning back toward the east, but as it turns out, he is going to go west. And through the succeeding centuries, because Christianity has had such a strong influence in Europe, Paul's decision to go across the Aegean toward the west had repercussions that stretch all the way to the modern period. So in any case, they are going to move from Asia Minor over to the Grecian peninsula. Initially, Paul was thinking of going back toward Bithynia, and that would be an area that is just south of the Black Sea, which would be, for modern people, would be on the northern part of the country of Turkey. They had ended up at Troas on the coast of the Aegean near the ancient site of Troy, and were thinking then of turning back eastward. But in fact, as Luke indicates, Paul had a vision of a man from Macedonia calling for help. Come over and help us. Macedonia would be right across the Aegean Sea, and it is in the upper part of the Grecian peninsula. And so the Holy Spirit redirected Paul from the east and sent him to the west. So taking this as the direction they should go, they got passage across the Aegean, probably on a commercial vessel of some kind. There were no what we would call passenger vessels in the Greco-Roman world. And so if you were going to cross a body of water, especially something like a body of water the size of part of the Mediterranean Sea, then you would need to find a booking on some kind of a commercial vessel, probably a coaster that went from port to port, both loading and unloading goods on the way. So in any case, they got across the Aegean and they landed at the port city of Neapolis, which is near Philippi. Now, it is at this point that Luke begins using first-person pronouns we and us as he talks about the travels of Paul. And that directly implies that at this point, Luke has joined the missionary team. Luke does not talk about the circumstances in which he joined the team, but the fact that this will continue until verse 17 of Luke of Acts chapter 16, and then he's going to resume that again when he gets into chapter 20. All of this indicates that during this period of time, Luke was part of the missionary team. Now, this is Philippi, or the excavations of Philippi. Philippi was excavated back in the early part of the 20th century by French archaeologists, and they have uncovered the agora and some of the major structures that were part of the city of Philippi at the time that Paul went there. If you follow my cursor way up in the upper right, you can just barely see a little hint of the river that goes around the edge of Philippi. It kind of follows along where these trees are and back up in this direction. Paul is going to meet with a group of Jewish women somewhere along this river where they were having a prayer service. Now, the people of Philippi are largely Greeks and Romans. There does not seem to be a very large Jewish community there, and there does not seem to be a synagogue. Within Jewish tradition, you needed 10 males in order to form the nucleus of a synagogue, and so apparently Philippi did not have that many. So there is a group of Jewish women who are meeting along the river for a prayer service, probably a bit of a takeoff from a synagogue service. And Paul and his group is going to meet with them just outside the city. Now, it seems that Paul and his group doesn't stay in Philippi very long. What Luke says is they stayed there some days, which sounds like a few days. We don't know exactly how long, but however long it was, even though it wasn't a long stay, it would be a very eventful stay. Now, there will be some places where Paul is going to stay much longer periods, but this one seems to be relatively short. So they joined this Sabbath prayer group of Jewish women, and while they were there, they encountered a woman by the name of Lydia, who was a merchant from Thyatira in Asia Minor, which is back on the other side of the Aegean. We don't know a lot about her other than that she was a merchant, but Thyatira was a center that had a substantial textile industry, and this woman was a merchant of textiles. So perhaps she was a Jewish proselyte, perhaps she was a God-fearer. In any case, she is going to accept the message of Paul, and she and her whole household would be baptized. Now, this is the first glimpse we have of the beginning of what would be called a house church or a household church. Households in the Greco-Roman Empire were relatively large groups. I think today, when we think of a household, at least in the modern Western sense, we think basically of mom and dad and 2 or 3 kids or something like that. But in the Greco-Roman world, a household, the term oikonomia, the household, was a large inclusive unit that often included not only extended members of the family, but also sometimes clients, slaves, a variety of people that worked in the same industry, in the same occupation. So this woman, Lydia, we don't know the size of her household, but it was not uncommon, at least, for households to have as many as 50 or 60 or more people in them. She, of course, is sort of the head of this household. We don't know whether she was married or not. It doesn't really say anything about that. She may have been a woman of independent means. But in any case, she and her household were baptized when the apostles preached to them. And on one of the Sabbaths, they are going to be confronted by a slave spiritualist. It is interesting the way Luke describes this in the Greek text of the New Testament. Most of your English translations are going to say that she was had the spirit of divination, or she was a sorcerer or something like that. What Luke actually says, quite literally, is that she had the spirit of a python. Which is probably an idiom for someone who had the spirit of divination. In any case, Paul is troubled by her because she seems to cry out after them. And so he exorcised the demon within her. But her owners are now furious because she's not as useful to them as she once was. And so they drag Paul and Silas into the agora before the magistrates. Now, the agora would be the central part of Philippi, including the marketplace, and the magistrates would be people who had authority to handle civil cases. So they dragged Paul and Silas into the agora before the magistrates. The magistrates immediately arrested Paul and Silas, flogged them, and had them jailed under guard in the stocks in the common prison. Well, that's going to turn out with a lot of different wrinkles that makes for an exciting story. For one thing, Roman flogging varied with the status of the prisoner. Generally, slaves were whipped. Free men were beaten with rods of elm or birch. In fact, later in his 2 Corinthian letter, when he lists some of his hardships in missionary work, Paul would say that he experienced 3 times being beaten with rods in this way. So they were flogged and they were put in the common jail, and they consoled themselves by praying and singing while the other prisoners listened, probably praying and singing from the Psalter or the book of Psalms. That would be what is typical of Jewish prayer. But abruptly, sometime in the middle of the night, there was an earthquake that violently shook the jail. The anchor bolts of the prisoners that were fastened into the walls were loosened. The prison doors were jarred open, and it was quite an exciting evening. The Philippian jailer, who was responsible to keep the prisoners, he was very disturbed because he found the jail open and the chains loosened. He thought his prisoners had probably escaped, And under Roman law, a jailer who allowed his prisoners to escape was in fact punishable by death. So this Philippian jailer, fearing the very worst, is on the verge of committing suicide. He thinks that he'd better kill himself, because if he doesn't, they're going to kill him, and they'll probably do it in a much more painful way. In any case, he's on the verge of killing himself when Paul stops him and says, "Don't harm yourself. Everybody's here. No one's escaped. We're all right here." And so Paul begins to explain to this Philippian jailer the Christian message. And the upshot of it was that the jailer and his whole household accepted the new faith, and they were baptized. Now, at this point, I'll just briefly comment on a theological issue that arises with the baptism of a household. We've already noted that Lydia's household was baptized. Here, the Philippian jailer's household is baptized. And if a household was a group of people, usually several families, the odds are pretty good that there were some children, maybe even some babies within this group. Since Luke specifically says that they were all baptized, that might imply that there was in this case the baptism of infants. At least that's the way that the side of the Christian church that accepts infant baptism is going to read this passage. Those who are from a more Baptist persuasion, preferring the baptism of those that are old enough to confess their faith, they generally are reluctant to read it in this way. But anyway, this is one of several passages in the New Testament that talk about household baptisms. And it is because of the nature of the household that the argument flows that the household probably included infants and children. And if they were all baptized, that would mean that some of those that were baptized would have been very small. In any case, regardless of the upshot of that, and Christians, of course, differ about that. There are those who will baptize infants in the same way that in the ancient faith of Israel, infants were circumcised when they were 8 days old. Then those churches who do baptize infants practice confirmation, the confirmation of their faith at a later time. Those who don't practice infant baptism generally baptize children when they're somewhere around the age of, I suppose, 12 or their early teens or something like that. But they often also practice the dedication of infants, which doesn't have any biblical precedent in the New Testament, other than the dedication of the firstborn, which is a Jewish ritual and really doesn't have anything to do with Christianity per se. So it's a bit of a tricky issue, and Christians come down on both sides of the fence on that. In any case, when the magistrates sent officers to release Paul and Silas, Paul reveals that both he and Silas are Roman citizens. And at this point, Paul is pretty forthright. We are citizens, and you have done something that is strictly illegal, because to arrest and to corporally punish a Roman citizen without a formal hearing and a formal sentence and the ability of the accused to offer defense for themselves, that was a serious violation of Roman law. Paul knew it, and he's not slow about making sure they know they've actually crossed the line here. So, as it turns out, the magistrates in Philippi are very disturbed by realizing that they have now compromised themselves. We'll come back to that in a moment. This is the traditional site of the imprisonment of Paul and Silas. The tradition goes back into the early centuries of the Christian church. Archaeologically, this site was actually a cistern that was used for storing water in the first century, but it had been transformed very early into a small Christian church. And the interior walls of this church are covered, or were covered, with paintings of Paul's arrest, the miraculous freedom when the earthquake happened, and then the baptism of the jailer's family. So if you ever get to go on a tour of Greece and get to go through Philippi, you can go visit this ancient jail where at least tradition, very early tradition has it that Paul and Silas were imprisoned. Well, the officials in Philippi, as I mentioned, they're quite disturbed, probably fearful that they could come under significant censure from their superiors when it was discovered that they had breached Roman law. And so now they are going to personally escort Paul and Silas out of the city. They're not just going to send them away. They're going to do their best to make as many amends as possible. As it turns out, Paul was not going to press the issue, but he and his group are, in fact, going to leave. Now, when they left Philippi, however, the language of Luke is going to change now from we and us to they and them. So it seems from that Luke is going to be left in Philippi, and he will be sort of the default leader of this small group of Christians that begins in Philippi. Paul and his party are going to leave by the Via Egnatia. This is a very important Roman road that went all the way across the upper part of Macedonia. In fact, it went all the way from the Adriatic Sea in the west to the Aegean Sea in the east. So it was an overland route between Asia Minor and Italy without having to sail all the way around the Greek Peloponnesus. So anyway, Paul and his party are going to travel down this road westward from Philippi. And as you can see in this photo, there are some significant remains of the Via Egnatia still in existence, actually still used after all of these many centuries. Maybe it's appropriate at this point to say something about what appears to be Paul's church planting strategy. And I'm doing it here because he's going to pass through two major cities, Amphipolis and Apollonia. But he's not going to stop at either of them. Now, Luke makes no mention of why Paul decided not to stop and preach at these cities. He just passes through. He doesn't stop. Maybe they didn't have a Jewish synagogue, or maybe it was for some other reason. Luke just doesn't offer an explanation, but he does seem to indicate in the book of Acts that Paul was very sensitive to what he felt was the leading of the Holy Spirit about where he should preach. This is mentioned a couple of times in the book of Acts, but you'll find it is also something that Paul mentions in his own letters, that he wants to be sensitive to the direction of the Holy Spirit. So for reasons unknown, they pass through both of these cities without stopping, but they eventually work their way westward until they find another city where they will stop. Now, Paul seems to focus on very strategic, what I would call footholds, from which the message of Jesus could be spread to other adjacent territories. That seems to be the case with him stopping at Thessalonica. That seems to be implied in the letter to the Colossians. So all of the places that Paul preaches seem to be centers of Roman administration. In other words, these are central cities that have some sort of either jurisdiction or influence over the adjacent areas. Sometimes they have a strong Jewish influence, and of course, where that is true, there will be a synagogue. Sometimes they may have commercial importance. But in any case, these are the kinds of places where Paul seeks to establish churches. So they make their way westward and they end up at Thessalonica, which is the capital of Macedonia's second district and the largest city in the district. It was, in fact, a free city with its own democratic assembly. Now, they obviously, being democratic, they were not an independent kingdom or something like that. They are working under the jurisdiction of the Senate in Rome. But nonetheless, the Senate has given them permission to have a democratic assembly and to create a lot of their own policies by the raising of hands, a democratic process. Thessalonica had become a center for poets, some philosophers, and other public speakers. The leading families in Thessalonica were pretty well educated. They were generally well-to-do. So Paul is going to begin in the city by preaching in the synagogue, as was his usual pattern. And he preaches the message of Jesus' death and his resurrection. Now, I do find it interesting that in the Greek text of the book of Acts, Luke is going to use 5 different verbs to describe Paul's presentation of the message of Jesus in Thessalonica. And I think these sort of give us a flavor of the kind of dialogue into which Paul is going to enter in these various cities. The first one is dialegomai, which is a verb that means to discuss or to lecture. The second is the word dianoigo, which means to open up or to explain something. A third verb is paratithemi, which means to prove or to point out or to demonstrate certain kinds of things. The fourth word is katangelo, which means to announce. And of course, the announcement would certainly have included the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. And then the final word is petho, which means to persuade or to convince. So in using these 5 different verbs, Luke seems to show that Paul's presentation of the gospel was a combination of different kinds of rhetorical styles, and to use those to the best advantage that he could, given the people to whom he was speaking. Because Thessalonica was a free city and was democratic in its government, the Roman Senate had allowed it to be administered by what are called politarchs. This particular inscription, which is a rather large inscription, it's in the British Museum in London. If you ever get to the British Museum, you may or may not get to see this piece. This is in a basement gallery, which is, quite frankly, often not open. I've been to the British Museum a dozen or more times, and only once have I gotten into this room because it's usually closed to the public for whatever reason. It has a lot of Greco-Roman stuff in it. But anyway, it has this large inscription from the Vardar Gate in Thessalonica. And what is of interest in this inscription is that it lists the 6 politarchs in the city. Now, when you're reading an English translation of the Bible, they're not usually going to use the word politarch. They're going to say something like either rulers of the city or city administrators or something like that. But the term that Luke uses is a very specific term. In the introduction to the book of Acts, I mentioned that at various times Luke takes care to use very particular terms, especially within Greco-Roman culture. And this is one of those places. He is going to use the term politarch to describe the rulers of the city. This is the archaeological excavations of the Agora in Thessalonica, or the marketplace. As you can see, the excavation is right in the middle of a bunch of apartment buildings, but the apartment buildings are built around the excavation. I think the excavation began before most of these apartment buildings were actually built. But in any case, this gives you just a little bit of a flavor of the city to which Paul came and in which he preached. Well, there is a bit of a mixed response in Thessalonica. Some of the Jews, God-fearing Gentiles, and some of the prominent women in the city were very accepting of Paul's message. But within the larger body of the synagogue, there were synagogue members who were not so happy with Paul. In fact, they were inflamed with this message that Jesus was the Messiah. They even incited riots, and in one case, they broke in to one of the homes of the Thessalonians that had accepted Paul's message, probably searching for Paul and Silas. I don't know if they were there at the moment or not, but in any case, it gets to be a very, very tricky and a very polarized situation. So some of these new believers, they drag before the politarchs, and they accuse them of rebellion against Caesar. Well, that's a serious charge in the Roman Empire. In fact, it's a charge that often ends in execution. So these new believers are being accused before the politarchs. this is a sensitive charge for another reason as well. In the city of Rome, Claudius had expelled the Jews from Rome in AD 49. He considered the Jews in Rome to be instruments of turbulence, and so he basically said, you have to get out. In fact, we find in a little later in the book of Acts that a young couple by the name of Prisca and Aquila originally were living in Rome, but that they have been driven out of Rome in this charge from Emperor Claudius. In fact, we also know from other Roman records that Claudius wrote missives to Alexandria, Egypt, which is the second largest city in the empire. And again, he warns them about the Jews who he says are fomenting a general plague throughout the whole world. So this is a very negative comment about Judaism and the Jews. And since Paul and Silas are themselves Jewish, well, at least Paul is. Silas, I'm not so sure about, but at least Paul is Jewish. In any case, this may figure into a general suspicion that Jews are some sort of rabble-rousers and that they needed to be dealt with a strong hand. In any case, to spare the new converts any more distress, Paul and his fellow missionaries are going to leave that very night, and they're going to go to the city of Berea. But this is a city that is not on the Via Egnatia. So instead of continuing westward, Paul is going to turn southward, and he will end up in the city of Berea. Now, once again, they're going to attend the synagogue. Berea has a synagogue, and here the response is much more positive than it was in Thessalonica. In Thessalonica, they only stayed there a relatively short time. In fact, the way it sounds from the book of Acts, it says that they were there basically 3 weeks. Whether that is a generalism or not, we're not sure, but I know in the Thessalonian letters, Paul talks about being torn from them in such a short period. But in any case, they end up at Berea, and here there is a positive response. In fact, here is the famous passage that is often cited, that the Bereans were more noble than those of Thessalonica, and they searched the scriptures every day to see whether what Paul said was valid. Eventually, however, some Jews from Thessalonica arrived, and once more, Paul is going to be forced to leave. This time, he's going to leave Timothy and Silas behind to help consolidate some of these new converts. So when he left Philippi, he apparently has left Luke. When he leaves Thessalonica, he apparently is leaving Timothy and Silas, who have agreed to join him later. Paul, for his part, is going to continue southward toward the Peloponnesus, and he sails for Athens, which is just north of the Peloponnesus, which is that almost island with a very narrow neck that connects to the Grecian mainland. So Paul arrives at Athens, the famous city, famous for a number of reasons, both for its philosophers as well as for its championship of democracy, a form of democracy going back into the golden age of Athens. So Luke is going to describe Paul as reaching Athens alone. So he doesn't have Luke with him anymore. He doesn't have Silas with him anymore. He gets to Athens basically by himself. And while he was there, he's looking over the city and very disturbed by the fact that there is so much idolatry. There seem to be temples and idols on almost every corner. Of course, Athens is home to the Parthenon, which is sort of the supreme temple in the city. And he does join the local synagogue. He preaches there, but he also speaks in the agora, the marketplace, concerning Jesus and the resurrection. And he gets into a discussion with various kinds of thinkers in Athens, including people from the philosophical branches of the Stoics and the Epicureans. In fact, it was through his discussion with these philosophers that he is invited to attend the Areopagus and to speak, in fact, to the council that basically supervises education and visiting lectures in Athens. So This has been a different sort of ministry for Paul in Athens. Now, Stoicism and Epicureanism had very long history, so I'm going to talk just a little bit about them since Paul interacts with both of these groups. By the time that Paul gets to Athens, they have been in existence for over 3 centuries. Both of these branches of philosophy had a penchant for individualism. They had a stronger emphasis upon the individual than they did upon the welfare of the society, which is not to say they weren't concerned at all about society, but they were focused upon the individual person. And categorically, they denied spiritual substances. Even the gods and the soul were believed to be material. Now, that's a really interesting kind of idea because that isn't the way probably most Greeks actually understood things. Generally, most Greeks had a perception that there was both a spirit world, which is good, and a material world, which is bad. But in Stoicism and Epicureanism, even the gods were material, and even the soul was thought to be material. So let's talk just a moment about Stoicism. Zeno was the founder of the Stoics, taught that the cosmos is an ordered whole in which, in the end, all things that seem to be contradictory will be resolved. And that will be, of course, a resolution for the good. Evil is relative, and evil things are just necessary incidents on the way to perfection. So since evil is relative and evil things are just things that happen and there's no way to avoid them, they're just going to happen, evil doesn't have the spiritual category that sometimes you would think would be associated with, particularly from the standpoint of Judaism. Fate rules everything and everyone. Humans are only free in that they can accept their fate or they can fight against it, but they can't avoid it. So there's a very strong sense of determinism within Stoicism. And the very best way to cope with whatever happens is simply to sort of bite your lip and survive and live it through. In fact, which is why we still use the term stoic to refer to somebody with, as our British friends would say, someone with a stiff upper lip, someone who is willing to just tough it out and get through it. So the highest good for the Stoic was serenity of mind. Duty and self-discipline were extremely high values for the Stoic as they faced the fates and whatever the fates would bring. And so Stoicism was generally characterized by egalitarianism. In other words, they were not so much in favor of a class structure. They generally were pacifists, and they were humanitarian in their outlook. Epicureanism, on the other hand, was a little bit different than the Stoic way of thinking. Epicureanism is founded by Epicurus, so it's named after him, and he accepts the atomic theory of Democritus, that all things are made of invisible atoms. Now, it's going to be all the way up into basically the beginning of the 20th century before Western scientists are going to agree that all things are composed of atoms. But the idea, believe it or not, is very, very old. It goes back way before the time of Jesus, all the way back to the thinking of some of the early Greeks. So unlike the Stoics, Epicureans affirmed human freedom. So they were not of the opinion that you were bound by the fates. You could actually make choices, and those choices did, in fact, make a difference for you. The greatest good was pleasure. Now, you need to understand that when the Epicureans are talking about pleasure, they're not just talking about cheap happiness or physical pleasure or something like that, not just self-indulgence. But in their viewpoint, this is the kind of pleasure that results in serenity, avoiding pain, eliminating fear. This was the way to pleasure or to happiness. More or less along the lines, I suppose, of the American expression that you have the right to happiness. But by happiness, that doesn't mean you don't have any difficult times. It just means you've learned to take the best view of things regardless of what happens. Virtue, on the other hand, was not in and of itself good, but it was good as an instrumental means so long as it brought happiness. The gods, on the other hand, were a long way away. They were remote. They weren't very interested in the world. Mostly they were preoccupied with their own happiness. So these are the two groups in which Paul gets into discussions in the Agora, and it is through these discussions that he is going to be invited to speak at the Areopagus. This is the Areopagus. It's named after Ares, and the latter part of the word really basically means a big rock. And in fact, as you can see here, it was a big rock. If you ever get to go to Athens, you'll probably want to visit, I'm sure, the Parthenon, but you may also want to visit the Areopagus, which is where in the most ancient times there was a court that heard civil cases, but by the time of Paul, this was basically where the intellectuals met and they discussed ideas. So Paul is invited to speak at the Areopagus, and he is going to explain to them this new teaching about the resurrection of the dead. And a new teaching was something they were always interested in, apparently. The inset picture shows the ancient steps to the Areopagus. So if you ever actually get to visit this, you may want to walk up these steps, because these are, in all likelihood, the steps that Paul himself would have walked up when he was invited to speak at this site. So he begins his speech at the Areopagus by referencing an inscription that he discovered in the city that simply said, "To an unknown God," which was a very leading inscription, and Paul is going to use that as a point of departure. And his speech is going to follow basically three major points. First of all, he's going to start with the idea that God created the universe. Now, it's to the point that Paul is going to use the word God singular, not plural. So that in itself would have been striking in an Athenian context, because the Athenians, like virtually all people of the Greco-Roman world and the Gentiles, were polytheists. They believed in many gods. In fact, Paul will say that in his Corinthian letter, that in this world there are many gods and many lords. However, Paul is going to speak of God in the singular. There, in other words, one God. He is self-sufficient. You can't contain him in a temple. He doesn't need humans. He can live without humans. He doesn't have to have them to justify his existence. And then the second point is that all humans are related to and descended from one human. God started with the creation of one human, and all along, his purpose was that humans would seek him and, if possible, find him. And it's in this context where he's talking about all humans descended from one human, and God's purpose was for humans to seek him, that he's going to quote from two Greek poets, Epimenides and Aratus. I would suggest you don't quote from people that you haven't been reading. So the fact that Paul quotes from these poets either means that Paul had read them himself, or at least that their lines, their poetic lines, were so well known that he could simply cite them from common knowledge. In any case, his third point is that there is human accountability. So if God created the universe, and if he created humans in order to seek him, then he holds them accountable. And so he will eventually judge the world by the one that he's ordained to judge the world, which will be the resurrected Jesus. So let's just say a word about Paul's approach to pagans, because here in Athens, he is dealing with raw pagans. He's not dealing here with the synagogue Jews. He's dealing with pagan philosophers. And I'd like to just take a moment to compare what he says in his sermon at Iconium, which is also to pagans, and his discourse in Athens. You're going to see some striking similarities. In both places, he's going to start with the idea of the creator God. God made the heavens and the earth and the sea, everything in them. And in Athens, he says the same thing. God made the world, everything in it. From there, he goes on to talk about the past. In the past, God allowed the nations to go their own way. He didn't create a world of puppets. He created a world of people with freedom, and he allowed them to go their own way. And in Athens, he says in the past, God overlooked this ignorance of humans, but he has showed kindness to all humans. He's given them rain. He's allowed their crops to grow. He's given them the capacity to enjoy life. As he says in Athens, he gives everyone life and breath and everything else. So as you will notice when you compare these two messages to outright pagans, the one in Iconium and the one in Athens, they have some very common preaching points. And a word here about the poets that he quotes, because he does in fact elicit their support for the ideas that he's going to use. It is probably worth pointing out that he doesn't start talking about the Hebrew Bible or the Septuagint. They wouldn't have known anything about that. But he needs some kind of points of contact. And so these points of contact will be poetic lines from their own poets with which they were familiar. What he quotes from Epimenides is from the 4th stanza of the hymn to Zeus, in which Epimenides is rebuking some of the Cretans for building a tomb for Zeus. And Paul is going to quote this line, "But you," that is Zeus, "are not dead, for in you we live and move and have our being." I would suppose that probably many Christians who read this passage, "In you we live and move and have our being," sort of have the idea that probably Paul is maybe quoting from the Old Testament. He's not. There's no line like that in the Old Testament. He is quoting from a Greek poet, and the line is very clearly from the 4th stanza. And then he also quotes a line which is from a poem by Aratus called Natural Phenomena, in which Aratus is going to extol Zeus by saying, "Let us begin with Zeus, for we are also his offspring." So Paul quotes from Zeus. We are his offspring. So I don't know what you think about Paul quoting from Greek poets in support of the Christian message, but it certainly is a bold approach. And in fact, we're going to notice that Paul will quote from Greek poets a couple of other times in his letters. One in Titus, he also quotes from Epimenides, kind of a derogatory statement about Cretans. And then there is a short quotation from Menander in 1 Corinthians 15. So what about this use of Greek poets? Well, I would suggest that what Paul is doing here, he's trying to find a point of contact with his audience. I don't think that Paul thought that Epimenides or Aratus either were inspired prophets of Yahweh, like Isaiah or Jeremiah or something like that. And I don't think he's quoting them as though they were final authorities for Christian faith. But I do think he is trying to find a way to make contact with his audience. And so he's going to say that some of the things that your own poets have said are in fact true. And that brings us to, I think, a general principle that is worth reiterating, and that is that all truth, insofar as it is the truth, is God's truth. Now, we believe that the scriptures are true, but we find truth in places other than the scriptures. If you want to, prove the Pythagorean theorem, you're not going to find that in some book in the Bible. You're going to have to go to a mathematics textbook. But that doesn't mean it's less true because it doesn't come from the Bible. It just means that all things that are genuinely true are God's truth. And I think that's probably the way we ought to understand Paul's quoting of these Greek poets. Well, everything went on pretty well until he got to the part about the resurrection of the dead, and then they started laughing at him. Earlier, they had used a pejorative term toward him. In Greek, this is called a spermalagos, which is basically a seed picker. What they basically accuse Paul of is that he's just picking up, bits and pieces here or there from different thinkers and kind of stringing them together into a new philosophy. But when he starts talking about the resurrection of the dead, then they start actually hooting at him because this seems to them to be absolutely absurd. Way back at the institution of the Areopagus many years earlier, the poet Aeschylus had depicted the god Apollo as saying, when the dust has soaked up a man's blood, once he is dead, there is no resurrection. And so the idea of resurrection was way out there for these people. At least one member of the Areopagus accepts Paul's message along with a few other Athenians. Whether there was actually a Christian congregation started in Athens, we don't know. There was at least a handful of people who believed Paul. Later, in one of his letters, Paul is going to say that the Corinthians were the first fruits of Achaia. So Luke just doesn't tell us much other than that. And Paul is going to go on a bit southward and eventually be joined by some of his companions. So this is where we will suspend the 7th lecture.